Just got my baby back. She had a flat tire. Thought I'd take her for a spin real quick, see how she's holding up. Sometimes it's all right to suck. All right, I remember when I got my first camera, I really did suck a lot. That's because I didn't know really much about cameras, and I didn't know about the exposure triangle. The most important part of shooting is the exposure triangle. All right, so what exactly is the exposure triangle, you say? It consists of three things, obviously, because a triangle has three sides. All right, first you got the triangle. So you got shutter, aperture, and ISO. All three of those things make, wait a second, that says triangle. The best way to think about the exposure triangle is to think about your camera like it's your eyeball. So your shutter on your camera is like your eyelid on your eyeball, opening and closing. The faster that shutter speed, the faster it's going to open and close, just like your eyelid. So if my eyes was shut and I open and close it quick, that's like having a fast shutter speed. What that means is that if it's fast, that shutter is going to let in less light, and it's also going to capture less of that image moving. So if you had a car driving past the frame and you took a picture on a fast shutter speed, what that's going to do is only going to capture that fraction of a second. But if you left that shutter open longer, just like your eyeball open up longer and then shutting, well then what's going to happen is it's going to let in more light into the sensor, and it's also going to capture more of that movement. So you might capture the car actually moving, and it's going to create some blur. So most of the time, if you're located in America, you're going to be editing your footage on a 24 frames per second timeline, which means you're going to want to be shooting normal footage like this, like me here talking, at 24 frames per second. Now, as a rule of thumb, you always want to set your shutter speed at double your frame rate. So if I'm shooting on 24 frames per second, I want to be setting my shutter speed at 1/50th. If I'm shooting some slow-mo at 60 frames per second, then I want to be setting my shutter speed to 125. If I'm shooting some really slow motion at 120 frames per second, I'm going to be setting my shutter speed to 250. Now all this is going to help you get the most natural looking motion blur to your eyeballs, all right? Too low of a shutter speed, you're going to get too much blur. And too fast of a shutter speed, you're not going to get any motion blur. So there may be times when you don't want to follow that rule of doubling your shutter speed. And that's in the case of like where you actually want motion blur. So in this example, this fountain I shot here, I purposely lowered the shutter speed pretty low so I could get that motion blur in the water. But for the most part, you're gonna want to be using double the shutter speed that your frame rate is. So your aperture is like the pupil on your eyeball. All right, when you're in a dark place, your pupil gets bigger so that it lets in more light. And when you're in a light place, then your pupil gets smaller to let in less light. Inside your camera lens, you got these little blades that make a hole. All right, when you're in somewhere light like I am now, that hole needs to be smaller to let in less light. And when you're somewhere dark, it needs to be bigger to let in more light. All right, so that's your f-stop numbers. The lower the f-stop number, like an f1.8, is going to let in more light. All right, and when you have a higher f-stop number, like an f22, it's going to let in less light. Right now I'm in a bright area and my aperture set on f7.1. Now let's go to the dark area and I'll show you what a 7.1 looks like. So now I'm over here in a shaded area with the same aperture I had over there in the bright area at f7.1. So now you can see that, well, you can probably barely see me. So what I got to do is I got to make that hole larger and let in more light. And I do that by lowering my f-stop number. All right, so now, as you see, I'm lowering it. Now I'm at f2.8. That's as low as this lens can go, and I look a lot better now. I might not even be as bright as I need to be. Another thing that's important to note about aperture is that when you got a lower f-stop number, the blurrier your background gets. All right, and the higher the f-stop number, the less blurry your background gets. So make sure that's something you take into consideration when you're setting your aperture, because you may want to blur your background. Here, I'll give you an example right here while I'm riding old Esmeralda. All right, take a look at my background right now. Should look pretty blurry. All right, and this is only on an f-stop of 2.8. That's the lowest this f-stop will go on this camera. All right, so now my f-stop is at f22. Now the background should look a lot more clear and crisp and in focus compared to the f2.8 that I was using before. Hopefully you can notice the difference. I'll try to put a side by side if possible. But right now it's getting hot. It's over 100 degrees here in Texas. All right, I'd be worried this camera's about to overheat, but hasn't overheated me yet. I can ride down hills, around hills, and I can ride in heat, and I can survive in the winter. So that's what brings me to the last part of the exposure triangle, the ISO. And that's pretty much just like your sensitivity to light. So if I go into a dark area, like let's say right now it's fairly dark, and I want to increase my lens's sensitivity. All right, I don't got anything left in my aperture. I can't go any lower. So what I can do, I can increase my ISO. Now look, as I increase it, the image brightens up. The problem with ISO is that it's essentially just fake light. It's not real. The more ISO you add into your image, it's going to create some kind of like snow. You know, or I don't know if you've ever seen that. If you're in Texas, we definitely don't see any snow. But it's like a whole bunch of little white speckles, right? Or they call it noise as well. So if the more ISO you put in your image, the more snow or the more noise you're going to have. So it doesn't make your images clean and clear and crisp, all right? So that's always your last resort, at least my last resort, for adding light to my image. I usually want to keep it as low as possible.